The history of the Nagasaki bomb. World War II was the second time in history that almost every country in the world was picking sides and warring with one another, and it was the first time in history that nuclear weapons were used. And those weapons were one of the biggest deciding factors in how World War II ended. Today we're going to be talking about the history of the atomic bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki, and what the aftermath has led to today. Be sure to stick around until the end to see how Nagasaki recovered from such a major and deadly event. And hey, if you enjoyed today's video, please be sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and slam that notification bell so that you don't miss any of our amazing uploads. If we're going to be taking a look at one of the most dangerous weapons in history, we first need to talk about how and why it was created. You see, it all started around 1933 when, after reading research done by other scientists, a physicist named Leo Szilard came up with a theory. That theory was that if you could somehow split an atom, that act alone would release an insane amount of energy, now known as nuclear fission. And the energy released from that one atom being split would set off a chain reaction, splitting one atom after another. This became known as a nuclear chain reaction, which meant two things. One, there was potentially a new form of energy, and two, there was the potential for superweapons. After getting help from another scientist named Enrico Fermi, in 1934, the pair were able to patent the atomic pile, aka the nuclear reactor. And in case you didn't know, a nuclear reactor is essentially something that can create and maintain a self-sustaining nuclear reaction. This brings us to 1938. Hitler was making his moves, and to make matters worse, Germany had achieved nuclear fission. This prompted Szilard to write a letter to the government, which was signed by Einstein for credibility. The letter was short and to the point, and basically let the government know that there is a potential for atomic superweapons, and Germany might have them first if the US doesn't act now. This then prompted the United States to begin running what it considered to be the most secretive project in our history, the Manhattan Project. This was a 4-year project that involved 43,000 people, including European and American scientists. And the main goal was to beat Germany to the punchline when it came to atomic power. And in July of 1945, a team led by U.S. scientist Oppenheimer, the world's first atomic explosion was successfully tested. And after seeing the scale of the explosion, something that was previously unknown, Oppenheimer would quote the Bhagavad Gita by saying the famous line, "I am become death, destroyer of worlds." By the time the first explosion was tested, the United States was still in the middle of World War II, but attention shifted off of Germany by that time and was more focused on Japan. And little did they know, the United States was gearing up to use an entirely new and deadly weapon. This use of the atomic bombs had been heavily debated for decades now, with some believing it was justified and others believing that it was an unnecessary act that resulted in the death of thousands of civilians. But we aren't here to argue which side is right. We're here with the facts, and the fact is that the United States decided to go forward with two different atomic bombs. One of which was named Fat Man, and the other, which was slightly smaller, was named Little Boy. The first atomic bomb dropped was over the Japanese port city of Hiroshima. Little Boy exploded over the city, and to this day is considered to be the deadliest bombing in history. Around 66,000 people were killed directly from the explosion, and another 69,000 were injured, some worse than others. Of those 129,000 people injured, it is estimated that only between 20 and 40,000 were Japanese soldiers. The rest were civilian casualties. Only 3 days later, on August the 9th, 1945, the second atomic bomb, Fat Man, was dropped over Nagasaki. Fat Man was a plutonium-239 atomic weapon that was significantly larger than Little Boy. It was designed differently in terms of how it worked as well. While Little Boy relied on a bullet-like object being fired into the uranium core to set off the explosion, Fat Man needed to use a different triggering method entirely. You see, the Fat Man was designed using plutonium instead of uranium, which meant that the bullet-like object would melt before impact and nothing would happen. So unsteady, they designed the bomb with a tightly packed and dense core of plutonium surrounded by small explosives, and when the explosives would go off, it would make the plutonium even denser, pushing the atoms closer to one another until they break and implode, setting off the nuclear reaction. This happened thousands of feet above Nagasaki when the bomb exploded, and despite the explosion being brighter than the sun, it was lights out for the city. In total, between the two atomic bombs going off in Japan, there were a total of 200,000 deaths, both from the explosion and those exposed to the high amounts of radiation. Japan would end up surrendering almost immediately after the second bomb was dropped, and to this day it's the only country to have been attacked with a nuclear weapon. While Japan was left to rebuild what it could from the ashes that remained, the United States was experiencing a slight economic boom. However, the war might have been over, but now the world was about to begin an arms race, the likes of which it had never seen before. It seemed like every country in the world was now competing to see who could build the most and biggest atomic weapons. This, of course, was the Cold War. One of the longest-running wars in modern history, but also one where not a single shot was fired. The two biggest parties in the war were the United States and the Soviet Union, and they were essentially competing to see who would control most of the world, as bizarre as that might sound. At the end of the day, the winner of the war was basically going to be based on who had the most and biggest atomic weapons. This led to a lot of shifts in politics over the globe for the next 40 years, and it also led to a crazy advancement in how scientists understood nuclear physics. During this time period, people who were in school at the time began learning bomb drills. Due to the increase in the possibility of nuclear war, students were taught to hide under desks and to curl up into tight balls. It has been 76 years since the Fat Man went off 2,000 feet above the city of Nagasaki, and since then it has mostly been rebuilt and the city is once again active. If you went there today, at first glance you likely wouldn't think it was the site of such devastation all those years ago, but if you walk around you'll begin to see the monuments that have been constructed to remember such a crucial time in their history. Side-by-side pictures showing what the city was like then versus now make it seem like an entirely new city, as if it had never happened. But the toll that that bomb took on the people in Japan and on their economy is something that they will never forget. Survivors from the bombing recollect on that day and how close they were to dying in an instant. But the country takes pride in its ability to rebuild and stick together after such a trying time in its history and in the history of the world. As we said, Japan is the only country in the world that has been on the receiving end of atomic bombs, and it's amazing to see how much they've been able to rebuild and make an economic comeback in the time since then. The entire plan behind the bombs being dropped was to take away Japan's ability to wage war at the time, and there is no doubt that the United States was able to do that. As of right now, the two are allies and share strong and active political, military, and economic relationships with one another. It's hard to believe that there is something that can do so much damage in a mere instant, and to think these weapons of mass destruction were created almost 100 years ago is truly remarkable. What do you guys think? Was it necessary to get nuclear weapons involved in World War II? Be sure to let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay up to date with all our uploads.